Welcome to lesson 2 of using God's story in evangelism. So if you're watching this, hopefully you've already watched lesson 1 where we established the why, the what, the call, the need to evangelism. Basically, we established a biblical principle that all Christians are called to evangelize, to share the gospel with people that don't know who Jesus Christ is. And we're called to do that because without knowing Jesus, people are going to be separated from God for eternity. And so there's a need for all Christians to share what they believe. It's a natural outflow of their faith to share who Jesus Christ is, to proclaim, to herald the good news of Christ to people who don't know. Well, that was last week, and this week we're now going to take that turn and say, yes, we're all called to evangelize. We know that, but this material is about using God's story in evangelism. And so what does it mean to use story in evangelism, and why would we use story? Well, this lesson we're going to talk about the power of story and how everyone has a story, but most importantly, how God's story, the grand story of the Bible, the grand narrative of God's redemptive history actually encompasses all of our stories. It makes sense of them, which means there's natural bridges from our stories to God's story, which is why we can maybe use it for evangelism. So let's start with the power of story. Think about humanity. Think about who we are. We're naturally a storytelling people. We tell grand, big stories about creation to explain where we come from and where we're going. We tell smaller stories, maybe about morals or the virtues that we uphold. We tell stories to our kids about what we want them to be, and we communicate so much about what we believe to be true about the world through story. Just look at a couple of these quotes and how stories are part of humanity. We attempt to explain the world through story, and the stories we tell turn around and explain us. This is the idea that we tell stories to explain the world, but really, when we look at those stories, we see what we truly believe and what we truly believe about the world in which we live. There have been great societies that have not used the will, but there have been no societies that did not tell stories. Just the fact that humanity is a storytelling people. And then finally, it has been often said that we tell stories to know who we are, to understand ourselves and our place in the world. It's as though all of our stories are a way for the imagination to poke at the human condition, testing its boundaries and depths, looking for ways to understand the why behind the what of our lives. Our stories are seeking to understand what the world is and what we believe about the world. So take a moment. Maybe pause this video as you reflect upon these questions here about the power story. Do you agree that humans use stories to explain the world? Maybe you might question this and say, well, in a more analytical, scientific society, maybe we don't use stories anymore. Well, I would challenge that and say, even in that, when you look at how they communicate their scientific beliefs, they use a story form, a narrative form to do that. If you doubt me, just check out any of the popular scientific programming and you'll see them trying to tell a story about what they believe. So in what ways have you seen or done this, communicate truth through story? What are some stories you have heard that people tell to help explain their world or how they see it? Maybe you've heard some creation myths or creation narratives that are not of the Christian background belief that seek to explain why the world's the way it is. And then where do people get their stories nowadays? So think about these questions. Maybe answer them together if you're watching this with someone else, or think about them by yourselves. Pause the video and answer these questions. But as you think about these, notice that we can't escape story. It's all around us. Even when we say, well, where do people get their stories nowadays, we have to consider that we get our stories from the movies we watch, the shows we watch, the music we listen to. They're all communicating stories. They're communicating ideas through story form. And we have to be careful what we're taking in, because the power of story is that it asks people to suspend their belief from it and just assume the world the narrator is telling is true. And so it invites people in, which can be a great tool to invite people into the gospel story. But also you have to watch out because other stories can do that to us as well. So let's go on and think about the fact that everyone has a story. Everyone has a story. Our story is made up of our experiences, our struggles, our joys, our fears, and our successes, and that influences how we see the world. And so while we tell stories, we are experiencing a story, and we can think of our life and how we view the world as a story. You can take a moment and look up on YouTube. Chick-fil-A has a training video called Everyone Has a Story. And it does a great job of just illustrating all these characters in the restaurant, people working in the restaurant, that they have a story. Things are going along. Now, why would Chick-fil-A, in part of their training material, seek to put that out, to tell their associates, their workers, that everyone has a story? Well, it naturally gears them to think of these people as people. They have background. You don't know what kind of hurts or joys or they're going through right now. You don't know what they're experiencing, and that might contribute to how they act towards you or how they're responding to different situations. Chick-fil-A does a really good job of training their people to see people as people, customers as people, and respond in kind. But that is what we should do in evangelism. That when we know that everyone has a story, this means that we need to see everyone as an individual. They're uniquely made by God. They're valuable in and of themselves, which means that when we come to evangelism, people cannot be projects. You can't have a pet project with a person trying to win them to Christ. No, they're a person who needs to be told the truth of who Jesus is in as winsome a way as possible. But they're not a project. And knowing how people have a story can help us proclaim the gospel. How do you think that could be? Take a moment and think about that. Well, I think knowing everyone has a story helps us proclaim the gospel, because if we know what people are going through, if we take the time to listen and get to know them, then we can see those bridges, those ways into, we can start broaching the subject of God, Jesus, eternity, things that help open the doors for evangelism. So everyone has a story, but what's bigger than that, one step up from that, is our stories, what we go through in life, how we experience life. All of this points to a bigger story. So whether it's the stories we tell or the stories we're experiencing and living, they actually all point to a bigger story. That how we explain the world is showing our longings and our desires, and those longings and desires and maybe our troubles and all the mess of our stories that we write or we live are pointing to elements of this greater story. I like how Mike Cosper puts it like this: the stories we tell are part of the story he's, God, telling. We tell stories because we're broken creatures hungering for redemption, and our storytelling is a glimmer of hope, a spark of eternity still simmering in our hearts. That we tell stories that reflect his story. Why? Because we're made to experience and know his story, and we're longing for it. So think about some of the stories maybe you have told or you grew up hearing, and what do they point to? And in what ways do the stories we tell and long for and communicate show that we actually are part of God's story? So take a moment and think about those questions. But one step further than that our stories point to a bigger story is this idea that there is a story that not only our stories point to, but a story that makes sense of our stories. It explains why we experience life the way we do, or why we hope for things we hope for. There's a story that makes sense of all that we experience, and that's God's story. I'm just going to share with you several quotes. Some are longer than not, and you can read along with me as I read them. And these quotes are all just pointing to this amazing fact, because these authors put it so well, that God's story just makes sense of our story. So it says, I believe in the big story of the Bible. Creation, fall, redemption, and consummation is so pervasive, so all-encompassing of our world, that we can't help but echo it, our movements within it, when we're telling other stories. At the heart of our faith is the bold claim that in a world full of stories, with a world full worth of heroes, villains, comedies, tragedies, twists of fate, and surprise endings, there really is only one story, one grand narrative, sublime, subsumes and encompasses all the other comings and goings of every creature, real or fictitious, on earth. Theologians call it redemptive history, my grandfather called it the old story. Mike Cosper there is just telling us and pointing to the truth that God's story encompasses all of what we imagine and all what we experience, and explains why there's heroes and villains, tragedies, twists of fate. They're really all kind of being encompassed in God's story. Nancy Guthrie puts it this way. There's another story, a story that's found in the pages of the Bible, from the book of Genesis through the book of Revelation, that shapes and defines where I came from, why I am the way I am, what my life is like day to day, and what is ahead of me in the future. It is this story that explains my deepest joys, as well as the empty places where contentment can be elusive. It is a story that explains my drive to be somebody and my sensitivity to feeling like a nobody. Explains what makes me cry and why I can laugh. This story explains my desire to look good, my craving for the good life, my longing for home and security, and much, much more. And whether you know it or not, this same grand story, the story found in the 66 books of the Bible, shapes the world you live in, who you are, and what you want to. That's why what you and I need to know this story is where we find the answers to our questions about what really matters now and into eternity. This story has the power to change everything about our stories. Nancy Guthrie is just showing that when we understand God's story, it actually makes sense of our story, and it changes how we see this world. It changes how we experience life. A few more. Through the stories we love to tell and hear, from Mozart's Requiem to liberal humanism's moral tale of universal love, to J.K. Rowling's story of sacrificial death and resurrection, we're reminded that even in post-Christian cultures, we can't seem to escape the echoes and at times the allure of the gospel story. He's just making this point that we actually, through the stories we tell, we show that we are still desiring this grand story of God's, that we're made to experience the redemptive story. And so we tell stories that reflect it or echo it, as he says. And then, talking about the grand story, we've been getting a story that is more than this true. It's the best story ever told. It's a story that makes sense of all other stories humans tell about the world. Jesus' story provides the answers to the questions that echo in but can't finally be answered from within these other stories. As it tells the story of evil being conquered by good. It tells the story of a hero who dies for his enemies. It tells the story of a ruler who loves his people subjects so much that he enters into their plight and suffers to save them. This is a story of grace upon grace. The story of a king who gave his only son so that we can become his sons and daughters. It's a story that leads to the home for which every human heart was made. And quite astonishing, he has called us to become his storytellers. Now it's switching. This grand story that explains our story, he's invited us to actually start telling his story so other people's stories can make sense in his story. The story that God's story makes sense of our stories. So do you believe that God's story makes sense of all of our stories? Feel free to push back on this. If you don't believe this, shoot me an email, communicate with me and explain this more. But this is the premise of this whole material, that God's story makes sense of a story. And if that's true, there's natural bridges in our stories, people's stories, that go into God's story so that we can use God's story to communicate who he is, who Jesus is, and how he has saved us. What stands out to you from those quotes? Look at those quotes again. Open up the hard material you have and look through and look at those quotes. What stands out to you from them, and how it talks about stories and how God's story makes sense? And what are some implications besides that? Besides the natural bridge building aspect of it, what are some implications of God's story explaining our stories? So think about that for a second. And as you do this, think about this verse in 2 Corinthians 10:5. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. If God's story encompasses every human being's story, it can be used to take every thought captive to obey Christ. Think about that. That if God's story truly encompasses everyone's story, then that could be a tool to help us destroy arguments against the knowledge of God, to take captive every thought to make it obedient in Christ, that this all-encompassing story can provide a framework, and not only for our lives to take captive every thought, but then to help other people see how their life is enfolded, encompassed, included in God's story. So if that's true, we have to think about this story, God's story, and what he's given us. So how would you explain God's story? When you're thinking about God's story, how would you explain it? And maybe how have you heard it been explained before? Some people might have heard God's story be explained as a love letter. The Bible is a love letter and is written by God. God loves us, and everything he's seeking to do is an expression of that love. And that's a good way to explain God's story. Kevin Van Hoser explains like this in almost a rom-com kind of way. God meets, creates world. God loses world. God gets world back. God and world live happily ever after. He's seeking to explain the whole concept of God's story in just this kind of tongue-in-cheek rom-com way. But it captures that idea, right? Reflecting on that idea of God's love. Maybe you heard God's story explained through covenants. That there's these relationships that God has with his people, and through these covenants that he has established, the covenant of works, and the covenant of Noah, and the covenant with Abraham, and the covenant with Moses, and the covenant with David, and finally the new covenant that's experienced in Jesus Christ, we see the God's story being played out. Maybe you can take aspects of that and say it's that whole idea of offspring that we find in Genesis 3:15 of this offspring or seed of Eve that's going to save humanity, and how we see that recurring theme, whether it's the child being looked for from Abraham and on, and that really only that child finally expressed that seed, that offspring, is Jesus Christ. It's another way to try to explain God's story, the grand narrative of Scripture. So there's many ways to do that, but just think about some maybe other ways you've heard people explain God's story. And as you think about, we've already talked about this a little bit, but do you think that God's story is useful to engage people in their own stories? Well, I hope that from what I've already said, I kind of jumped the gun on this question. I hope that you can see that this is true. That God's story helps us communicate to someone and say, hey, your story actually makes sense in a way that you don't even know. And it points to something even bigger than yourself or what you're going through. And that is God's story. Well, let's look at God's story. In this class, we're going to be using this breakdown for what God's story is. This is a simple breakdown. As many people have expressed this way, sometimes the last word is a little different, but it's this four plot movement kind of structure of God's story. It's creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. This is God's story that God created. God made this world, this cosmos. He made humanity. He made it all good. There's certain longings and desires we have that come from creation. But then humans messed up. Adam and Eve went astray. They rebelled. They rebelled against their rightful ruler. And so the fall happened. And because of sin entering the world is broken. Our desires are broken. Our relationships are broken. And so how we experience the world, so much of it is related to that fall. Then we got redemption. The fact that Christ came, the second person of the Trinity, comes down, takes on flesh, was one of us, represents us, lives the life we could not live, dies the death we deserve, and all through that provides redemption for us. And that this shows the longings that we have. This actually shows what we're hoping for. This actually shows maybe why we're hoping for a hero in our life, and so much more. And then consummation, the fact that the story does not end yet after redemption, but actually there is a ending. There is a happily ever after, that the promises come true. Every tear is wiped away. Every wrong is made right. That there is the marriage supper of the Lamb, that everything is how it is supposed to be, brought to completion, consummation. This is God's story. This is how we're going to approach it for the remainder of this material. We're going to go through these 4 parts and see how these are useful for evangelism and how they meet people's stories, meet people where they are. Now, a reminder, this story is most effective all together when we communicate it all together to people. But we're going to go week by week and talk about each structure because there's so much to talk about in each one. But as we do that, we have to remember that the full story is really where it becomes effective in explaining that there's a better story for people than what they might be believing about life. And as we do that, we're going to seek to make this very applicable for evangelism and talking to people about the faith, at least raising the plausibility of who Jesus is in God's story. And we're going to do that through challenging their story. For as we engage with people, we're going to remember that when we share God's story with people, we can do these three things for sure. We can affirm their story. So there's things that they experience, the things they're going through that we can point to and say, I understand you. And actually, I can tell you why I believe you're experiencing that. And so we can point to some of these plot movements, why they're longing for these things, or why they think they're made for this, or why there's hardship in their life. And so we can affirm their story. At the same time, we can challenge the story. We can actually say, hey, wait a minute. What you think might be the solution is not the solution. Or what you think might be the problem is actually not the problem. Or what you think might be how you should go actually is not how you should go. We can actually challenge them a little bit on how they see their life and challenge them on what they're telling themselves their story is. And then finally, this is where offering the gospel comes to someone. We offer a better story. We hold out the grand story of who God is and the great story of redemption through Jesus Christ and say, this story encompasses your story. And whether you know it or not, you are in this story. And so you can open your eyes to that reality and come to know who Jesus Christ is. And it makes sense of your life and offers you a better hope than anything else in this world. And that's what we're going to be seeking to do the rest of this time as we go through this material, is to seek to offer people a better hope for their life, the hope that can only be found in Jesus Christ. That sums up this lesson 2 of this material as we seek to know who Jesus is, know his story, and apply it. And so next couple of weeks, we're going to be going through God's story and seeing how that confronts people where they are and their own stories. And so if you have any questions, please contact me as we seek to go with this. If you can join us for the live class, please do so. We'll have much more conversation and back and forth and questions. And as we get later into the material, it becomes more important as we're going to have some practical scenario role playing going out as we seek to really wrestle with how God's story can be used for evangelism. I hope you have enjoyed it. Hope this has been beneficial. If you have any questions, reach out and contact me. And if not, I'll see you next week, either online or in person. Have a great week.